The sky over London cracked open without warning, and within seconds, every screen on Earth showed the same terrifying image. Massive dark shapes, larger than any building ever built, hung silently above the clouds. There was no message, no warning shot, no attempt at communication. Just silence, and then descent. Daniel Hargrove was standing in a crowded train station in London when the first tremor hit. The ground shook so hard that people fell against each other, screaming, grabbing onto railings and each other's arms. Outside, through the station's glass roof, he watched as one of the massive shapes lowered itself toward the city, blotting out the afternoon sun entirely. "What is that?" someone shouted behind him. Nobody answered. Nobody could. Within an hour, similar shapes had appeared over New York, Tokyo, Cairo, and dozens of other major cities. Governments scrambled to respond, but there was nothing in any defense manual, any military strategy, or any emergency plan that had prepared humanity for this moment. The alien fleet, later identified as the Vareth Dominion, had not come to talk. They had come to take. Laura Whitfield, a young engineer working at a research facility outside Manchester, watched the news unfold from her lab. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of her desk, watching footage of the alien ships releasing smaller crafts that descended toward the ground like a swarm of dark insects. She had spent her whole career studying satellite technology, trying to understand signals from deep space. She never imagined she would live to see where those signals came from. The first 24 hours were chaos. Military forces around the world attempted to respond, sending fighter jets and missiles toward the alien ships. The results were devastating, but not for the invaders. Human weapons barely scratched the surface of the Dominion's technology. Entire squadrons vanished in bursts of light too bright to look at directly. Radio communications went silent across regions the size of small countries. It became clear within hours that humanity's most advanced weapons were, to the Dominion, little more than a mild inconvenience. By the second day, several major cities had fallen under alien control. Streets that had once been filled with traffic and people now stood empty, patrolled by strange mechanical figures that moved with unsettling precision. Survivors hid in basements, subway tunnels, and abandoned buildings, watching through cracks and windows as their world changed forever. Daniel had managed to escape the station before the alien forces reached central London. He joined a group of survivors, mostly strangers to each other just days before, who had found shelter in an old underground parking garage. Among them was a former soldier named Nathan Pierce, who had served 2 tours overseas before retiring from active duty. Nathan quickly became a source of calm in the group, using his training to organize supplies and keep everyone focused. "We can't fight what we don't understand," Nathan said one evening, as the group huddled around a small battery-powered lamp. "But we can survive. And surviving is the first step to fighting back." Not everyone agreed. A woman named Claire Ashby, who had lost her husband in the first wave of the attack, argued that resistance was pointless. "You saw what they did to the fighter jets," she said, her voice breaking. "What can any of us do against that?" Nathan didn't have an answer that night, but he didn't stop believing there was one. Meanwhile, in Washington, what remained of the United States government had relocated to an underground facility, along with military leaders and top scientists. Among them was a woman named Grace Delaney, a research scientist who had spent years studying unexplained energy signatures detected near the edge of the solar system. She had once been dismissed by her colleagues as chasing shadows. Now, everyone wanted to hear what she knew. "These beings didn't just build ships that can cross galaxies," Grace explained to a room full of exhausted generals. "They built an empire on the assumption that resistance from primitive species like us would collapse within days. Their tactics are efficient because they've never needed to be creative. They've never faced anyone who fought back and survived long enough to adapt." One of the generals, a stern man named Edward Marsh, leaned forward. "So what are you saying, Dr. Delaney?" "I'm saying they expect us to break," Grace said. "And if we don't, we might actually have a chance." Across the world, similar realizations were beginning to form, quietly and separately, in bunkers, basements, and hidden shelters. The overwhelming might of the Dominion had crushed open resistance almost instantly, but it had not accounted for something deeply human, the refusal to give up. even when all logic said to. Back in London, Daniel's group had grown from 6 people to nearly 30, as more survivors found their way into the underground shelter. Food and water were becoming scarce, and the sound of alien patrol crafts passing overhead kept everyone on edge. Laura, the engineer from Manchester, had made her way into the city searching for her sister, and ended up finding the same shelter, drawn by rumors of a group that hadn't given up. "You're an engineer?" Nathan asked her, once introductions had been made. "I studied satellite systems," Laura said. "Communication tech, mostly. Why?" Nathan gestured toward a piece of alien technology that had been recovered from a downed scout craft near the edge of the city. It was smaller than expected, roughly the size of a car engine, with strange markings etched across its surface and no visible seams or screws. "We found this 2 days ago," he said. "Nobody here can make sense of it, but if there's any chance we can understand how they work, even a little, it might help us survive longer, maybe even fight back." Laura studied the object carefully, running her fingers along its smooth surface. She had never seen anything like it, and for a moment, fear crept back into her chest. But beneath the fear was something else: curiosity, the same drive that had led her into engineering in the first place. "I don't know if I can figure this out," she admitted, "but I'll try." As night fell over the ruined city, the group settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by distant sounds of alien crafts moving through the sky. Nobody knew what the coming days would bring, but for the first time since the invasion began, there was a flicker of something other than despair in the shelter. It wasn't hope exactly, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. In cities across the world, similar sparks were forming. In Cairo, a group of engineers who had once worked on renewable energy projects began studying the wreckage of a fallen alien craft, searching for weaknesses in its power systems. In Tokyo, a former police officer named Kenji organized neighborhood watch groups into a coordinated network, using old radios to share information about alien patrol movements. In Sao Paulo, a young mother named Isabella used her knowledge of the city's underground tunnels to guide dozens of families to safety, avoiding areas where alien forces had established checkpoints. None of these groups knew about each other yet. None of them understood that similar stories were unfolding across the globe. But each act of quiet defiance, each small discovery, each refusal to simply accept defeat, was adding up to something larger than any single person could see. Back in Washington's underground facility, General Marsh called an emergency meeting with the remaining military leadership and available scientists. The mood in the room was grim, but there was a shift in the air compared to the panic of the first day. "We've lost most of our conventional forces," Marsh admitted. "Air power, naval assets, most of our satellite network. If we try to fight them the way we're used to fighting, we will lose." "So we don't fight them that way," said a younger officer near the back of the room, a woman named Megan Voss, who had spent years working in unconventional warfare training. "We adapt. We use what they don't expect. Smaller strikes, guerrilla tactics, hit them where they're vulnerable, and disappear before they can respond." Grace Delaney nodded in agreement. "Their entire strategy is built on speed and overwhelming force. They expect immediate surrender. If we can survive long enough to study their weaknesses, we can start finding ways to exploit them." Marsh studied the faces around the table, exhaustion evident in every one of them. Just days ago, this room had been filled with confidence, backed by the most powerful military in human history. Now, that confidence had been replaced by something quieter, but perhaps more dangerous to the invaders: determination born from desperation. "All right," Marsh said finally. "We start small, we gather intelligence, we find every group of survivors we can reach, and we start building something the Dominion has never had to deal with before." "What's that?" Megan asked. "An enemy that refuses to stay defeated." As the meeting ended, and officers dispersed to relay orders through what remained of secure communication lines, Grace remained behind, staring at a large screen displaying satellite imagery of alien ship movements across the globe. The scale of the invasion was staggering, but as she studied the patterns, something caught her attention. The Dominion's forces were spread thin, covering enormous amounts of territory with what appeared to be a relatively small number of ships compared to the size of the planet. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Back in London, Laura had been working through the night, using tools scavenged from a nearby electronics shop to carefully examine the alien technology Nathan's group had recovered. Around her, exhausted survivors slept in makeshift beds made from blankets and cushions, while a few kept watch near the entrance of the shelter, listening for any sign of approaching danger. Just before dawn, Laura made a discovery. The strange markings on the device weren't random decoration, as she had first assumed. They were a form of circuitry, almost like a language written directly into the material itself. She couldn't understand what it meant yet, but she recognized the pattern of something designed to channel and direct energy. She woke Nathan gently, careful not to disturb the others. "I think this might be part of their communication system," she whispered, showing him her notes. "If I'm right, and if we can find more pieces like this, we might be able to figure out how they're coordinating their attacks." Nathan studied her notes carefully, though much of the technical detail was beyond him. "How long would that take?" "I don't know," Laura admitted. "Weeks, maybe. Longer. But it's something." Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of sunrise, illuminating a city that had been unrecognizable just days before. The smoke still rose from distant fires, and the silhouettes of alien structures had begun appearing across the skyline, replacing familiar landmarks with something cold and foreign. But inside the shelter, surrounded by strangers who had become something like family in the space of a few desperate days, Daniel felt something shift inside him. The fear was still there, sharp and constant. But underneath it, something else was beginning to grow. Not confidence, not yet, but a quiet refusal to simply disappear. Across the world, in bunkers and basements, in destroyed cities and hidden shelters, millions of people were feeling that same shift. The Dominion had expected total, immediate submission. Instead, they had unknowingly ignited something they had never encountered in all their conquests across the stars. They had underestimated humanity's capacity to endure, and that mistake would prove to be the beginning of their undoing. As the sun rose fully over London that morning, casting long shadows across a broken city, Nathan gathered the group together. Word had reached them through a battery-powered radio that other resistance groups had been discovered in different parts of the city, and possibly in other parts of the country as well. "We're not alone," he told them, his voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into his face. "There are others out there, doing exactly what we're doing, surviving, learning, waiting for the right moment." Claire, who had been quiet since her outburst days earlier, looked up at him with something new in her eyes. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the beginning of it. "What happens now?" she asked. Nathan looked around at the faces surrounding him, each one marked by loss and fear, but also by an unspoken determination to keep going. "Now," he said, "we get ready." Far above the ruined city, the alien ships continued their silent watch, confident in their conquest, unaware that beneath the surface of the broken world they believed they controlled, something was beginning to take shape. Something the Dominion had never encountered in all their years of expansion across the stars. The first sparks of resistance were beginning to catch fire, quietly, carefully, in the shadows of a world that refused to be broken. And soon, those sparks would become something the Varith Dominion could no longer ignore. 3 weeks had passed since the invasion began, and the world that remained was almost unrecognizable. Cities that once buzzed with traffic and noise now sat in eerie silence, broken only by the distant hum of alien patrol crafts sweeping through the sky. Yet beneath the surface of this shattered world, something was growing. Quietly, carefully, deliberately. In the underground shelter beneath London, Laura Whitfield had barely slept in days. Surrounded by scavenged tools and salvaged pieces of alien technology, she worked by the dim glow of a single lamp, piecing together fragments of understanding from a language that wasn't meant for human minds. Nathan Pierce kept watch nearby, occasionally bringing her water or food that she often forgot to eat. "You need rest," he told her one evening, setting a small plate beside her makeshift workstation. "I need answers," Laura replied without looking up. "I think I'm close to something." She had spent the past 2 weeks studying the strange device recovered from the downed scout craft, along with several other pieces gathered by scavenging teams sent out under cover of darkness. Slowly, painstakingly, She had begun to map out patterns in the alien circuitry, patterns that suggested a network far more vulnerable than anyone had initially believed. Their communication system isn't decentralized like ours, she explained, showing Nathan a series of diagrams she had sketched by hand. It relies on relay points, almost like towers, spread across a region. If one relay goes down, the others compensate. But if you take out enough of them at once, in the right pattern, you could create a blind spot. Nathan studied the diagrams carefully. A blind spot big enough to move through undetected? Maybe, Laura said. I won't know for certain until we test it. But if I'm right, it could give resistance groups a way to move supplies, coordinate attacks, and communicate without the Dominion catching on. It was a small discovery in the face of an overwhelming enemy, but it represented something the Dominion had never anticipated. Their conquered worlds had always collapsed into disorganized chaos, easily monitored and controlled. Humanity, however, was beginning to organize in ways the invaders' rigid systems weren't built to detect. Meanwhile, in Washington's underground facility, General Edward Marsh reviewed reports coming in from scattered resistance cells across the globe. What had once been isolated groups of desperate survivors were slowly beginning to connect, sharing information through old radio frequencies, hidden courier networks, and salvaged communication equipment. We've confirmed contact with resistance groups in at least 11 countries, Megan Voss reported during a briefing. Most are small, poorly equipped, and struggling to survive, but they're organized. They're sharing intelligence, and in a few cases, they've managed to slow down alien patrol movements in their areas. Slow down isn't stop, Marsh said, though there was less weariness in his voice than there had been weeks earlier. No, Grace Delaney agreed, stepping forward with a tablet displaying satellite imagery. But it's a start. And we've noticed something interesting in the patterns of their patrol routes. She pulled up a series of images, showing alien crafts moving across various regions. Their patrols follow rigid, predictable paths. They rarely deviate, even when faced with unexpected resistance. It's almost as if their entire military doctrine assumes total compliance from conquered populations. They don't have contingency plans for sustained defiance. Marsh leaned forward, studying the patterns. You're saying they don't know how to adapt? I'm saying they've never needed to, Grace replied. Every world they've conquered before ours broke almost immediately. We're the first to keep fighting this long, and it's throwing off their entire operational rhythm. It was a small crack in what had seemed like an unbreakable wall, but cracks had a way of growing. In Tokyo, former police officer Kenji Sato had spent the past 3 weeks building a network of lookouts across the city's remaining neighborhoods, using hand signals, colored cloths, and coded messages passed between trusted runners to track alien movement patterns. What had started as a simple survival measure was becoming something more organized, more strategic. They patrol this district every 6 hours, Kenji explained to a small group gathered in a hidden basement beneath what remained of a shopping district. If we time it right, we can move supplies through the tunnels beneath Shibuya without being detected. A young woman named Emiko, who had worked as a nurse before the invasion, studied a hand-drawn map spread across a table. And if we're spotted? Then we disappear, Kenji said simply. We know this city. They don't. It was a philosophy being repeated in cities across the globe. Humanity's greatest advantage against an overwhelming enemy wasn't superior technology or military might. It was intimate, detailed knowledge of their own world, knowledge the Dominion had never bothered to learn, because they had never expected to need it. Back in London, Daniel Hargrove had begun accompanying scavenging teams sent out to gather supplies and information from the ruined city. What had once been a terrifying, unfamiliar landscape was slowly becoming something he understood, mapped out through weeks of careful observation and hard-earned experience. Patrol comes through here every 4 hours, give or take, he told Nathan, marking a rough map they had assembled from various scouting missions. There's a gap in their coverage, near the old financial district. If we move fast, we can get in and out without being seen. Nathan studied the map carefully. What's there? A supply depot, Daniel said. According to some of the other survivors we've been in contact with, the Dominion has been storing captured human technology and resources in several locations across the city. If we can get inside, we might find something useful. It was a risk, and everyone in the shelter knew it. But the alternative, sitting in the dark waiting for supplies to run out entirely, felt like a slower, quieter form of defeat. And nobody in that shelter was ready to accept defeat, not after everything they had survived already. 2 nights later, a small team consisting of Daniel, Nathan, and 2 others from the shelter made their way through the ruined streets of London under cover of darkness. Laura had provided them with a modified device, built from scavenged parts and her growing understanding of alien technology, designed to create brief interference in the Dominion's monitoring systems. "It won't last long," she had warned them. "Maybe 10 minutes, if I've calibrated it correctly. Use that window wisely." The journey through the city was tense, every shadow and distant sound sending jolts of fear through the group. Buildings that had once been familiar landmarks now stood as broken, hollow shells, their windows shattered, their walls scarred by whatever force the Dominion had used to subdue the city in those first devastating hours. When they reached the supply depot, a converted warehouse surrounded by strange alien barriers, Nathan activated Laura's device. A faint hum filled the air, barely audible, followed by a subtle shift in the ambient lighting around the perimeter. "Now," he whispered, and the group moved quickly toward a gap in the barrier that Daniel had identified during earlier scouting missions. Inside, the warehouse was filled with rows of strange equipment, some clearly alien in origin, others recognizable as captured human technology, repurposed for unknown purposes. Working quickly, the team gathered what they could carry: pieces of technology, medical supplies, and containers of what appeared to be preserved food. As they prepared to leave, Daniel noticed something near the back of the warehouse that made his breath catch. A row of containment units, similar to cells, stood along the far wall. Through a narrow window in one of the units, he could see movement. "Nathan," he whispered urgently, "there's someone in here." The group approached carefully, and what they found sent a wave of mixed emotions through all of them. Inside the containment units were survivors, humans who had been captured during the initial invasion and held for reasons that remained unclear. Most were weak, exhausted, and disoriented, but alive. "We can't leave them," Daniel said immediately. Nathan hesitated, weighing the risk against the moral weight of the discovery. Every second they spent freeing prisoners was a second closer to discovery, a second closer to bringing the full might of the Dominion down on all of them. But he knew, deep down, that leaving them behind wasn't an option either. "Move fast," he said finally. "We get them out, and we get out of here." Working together, the team managed to free 6 survivors from the containment units, though several were too weak to walk without assistance. As Laura's interference device neared the end of its brief window, the group made their way back through the gap in the barrier, moving as quickly as the freed prisoners could manage. They made it back to the shelter just as the first hints of dawn began to color the sky, exhausted but alive, carrying with them supplies, information, and 6 additional survivors, who brought with them stories of what the Dominion had been doing within the walls of that supply depot. One of the freed prisoners, a scientist named Oliver Bramwell, had been captured while attempting to study alien technology near the initial landing site. What he had learned during his captivity provided crucial insight into the Dominion's operations. "They're not just conquering for territory," Oliver explained once he had recovered enough to speak clearly. "They're studying us, testing our technology, our biology, trying to understand what makes us different from the other species they've conquered before." "Different how?" Grace Delaney asked during a secure communication established between the London shelter and the Washington facility, using a modified relay system Laura had helped design, based on her growing understanding of alien communication networks. "I overheard fragments of conversation between their commanders," Oliver said. "They're confused by our resistance. Every other species they've encountered submitted almost immediately once their technological superiority became clear. We haven't, and it's causing friction within their command structure." This revelation, small as it seemed, represented a significant shift in understanding. The Dominion wasn't an unstoppable monolithic force, operating with perfect coordination. They were an empire built on assumptions that were beginning to crumble under the weight of humanity's stubborn refusal to surrender. As the days turned into weeks, resistance networks across the globe continued to grow, sharing information, coordinating small-scale operations, and slowly building a picture of the Dominion's weaknesses. In Cairo, engineers successfully disabled a small alien outpost by targeting its power core, discovered through careful analysis of a similar device to the one Laura had been studying. In Sao Paulo, Isabella's network had grown into a coordinated system moving hundreds of survivors safely between hidden shelters, avoiding alien patrols with growing precision. Back in London, Oliver Bramwell had begun working closely with Laura, combining his first-hand knowledge of the Dominion's inner workings with her technical understanding of their systems. Together, they were beginning to map out something that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier, a genuine strategy for resistance. Their command structure is rigid, Oliver explained during one of their late-night working sessions. Orders come from a central authority and rarely deviate based on local conditions. If we can disrupt communication between their command ships and ground forces, even temporarily, it could create confusion significant enough to exploit. Laura nodded, already sketching out potential modifications to the interference device she had built. If we can scale this up, target multiple relay points simultaneously, we might be able to create blind spots large enough for coordinated resistance action. Nathan, listening from across the room, felt something he hadn't felt since the invasion began. Not just determination, but genuine strategic hope. What had started as a small group of survivors hiding in an underground parking garage had grown into something with purpose, direction, and increasingly, capability. "How long until we can test something like that?" he asked. Laura and Oliver exchanged a glance. "Days," Laura said. "Maybe a week, if we push hard enough." Word of their progress spread quietly through the growing network of resistance cells, carried by trusted couriers and coded radio transmissions. In Washington, General Marsh reviewed the reports with a mixture of caution and cautious optimism. "If London's team can prove this concept works," he told the assembled officers and scientists, "we could potentially replicate it across other resistance networks. It wouldn't win the war, but it could give us the breathing room we need to organize something larger." Megan Voss studied the latest satellite imagery, tracking subtle shifts in alien patrol patterns across multiple continents. "Their confidence is starting to show cracks," she observed. "They're increasing patrol frequency in areas where resistance activity has been detected. That's not the behavior of a force operating with total confidence anymore." Grace Delaney allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first genuine expression of hope she had felt in weeks. "They came here expecting an easy conquest," she said. "They're starting to realize this isn't going to be easy at all." Outside, across a world scarred by weeks of occupation, small networks of survivors continued their quiet work, gathering information, sharing resources, and slowly building towards something the Vareth Dominion had never encountered in all their years of galactic conquest, an enemy that refused to break, no matter how overwhelming the odds seemed. In London, as dawn broke over the ruined city once again, Laura made a final adjustment to her modified device, her hands steady despite the exhaustion weighing on her entire body. Beside her, Oliver reviewed calculations one final time, while Nathan and Daniel prepared the team for what would be their most ambitious operation yet. "If this works," Laura said quietly, "it changes everything." "And if it doesn't?" Daniel asked. Nathan placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Then we try again. We don't stop. Not now." Above them, the alien ships continued their silent patrol, confident in their control over a broken world. They had no way of knowing that beneath the surface, humanity's resistance was no longer just surviving. It was preparing to strike back. And when that moment came, the Dominion would finally begin to understand exactly what they had underestimated. The interference device hummed to life in the basement of an abandoned office building, its modified core glowing faintly, as Laura Whitfield made final adjustments under the watchful eyes of Oliver Bramwell and Nathan Pierce. Outside, the city of London sat under a heavy gray sky, alien patrol crafts crossing overhead in their usual, predictable rhythm. Nobody in that basement knew if what they were about to attempt would work, but they knew they had to try. "This is it," Laura said, her voice steady despite the tension gripping the room. "If the calculations are right, we can create a blind spot across 3 districts for approximately 20 minutes. That should be enough time." "Enough time for what, exactly?" asked Claire Ashby, who had transformed over the past weeks from a grieving widow into one of the shelter's most capable coordinators. Nathan unrolled a map across the table, marking several locations with small red circles. Enough time to hit 3 separate targets simultaneously: a relay station, a supply convoy, and most importantly, a partially constructed structure the scouts believe is some kind of processing facility. Processing facility for what? Daniel asked, though the grim look on Oliver's face suggested he already suspected the answer. We don't know for certain, Oliver admitted. But based on what I overheard during my captivity, I believe it's connected to their long-term occupation plans. If we can destroy it before it's completed, it could set back their entire operation in this region significantly. The plan had come together over the past week, through careful coordination between multiple resistance cells across London, connected through the improved communication network Laura and Oliver had developed. It represented the largest coordinated action humanity had attempted since the invasion began, a genuine test of whether scattered resistance could become something more organized, more dangerous to the Dominion's control. As the team made final preparations, similar scenes were unfolding in other cities around the world. In Cairo, engineers prepared to target a power distribution hub using techniques developed independently but strikingly similar to Laura's work in London. In Tokyo, Kenji Sato's network prepared to disrupt patrol routes across multiple districts simultaneously, creating windows of opportunity for coordinated supply movements and, if the London operation proved successful, potential offensive action. None of these operations had been explicitly coordinated between continents. Communication across such vast distances remained difficult and dangerous. But something remarkable was happening regardless. Isolated resistance movements, born from desperation and shaped by similar circumstances, were arriving at similar strategies through independent innovation and hard-won experience. Back in Washington, General Marsh and his team watched satellite feeds with tense anticipation as reports filtered in from resistance cells preparing for coordinated action. Grace Delaney monitored alien communication patterns, watching for any sign that the Dominion had detected the growing resistance movement's plans. They're still operating on standard patrol protocols, Grace reported. No indication they've picked up on increased resistance activity in these specific areas. Their confidence might finally be working against them, Megan Voss observed, studying the same data streams. They've grown so used to easy conquest that they're not looking for coordinated resistance, even after everything that's happened. Marsh nodded grimly. Let's hope that overconfidence holds a little longer. As evening approached in London, the team prepared to move. Laura's device had been calibrated and tested as thoroughly as circumstances allowed, though everyone understood there was no way to be completely certain it would perform as intended under real conditions. 3 separate teams would move simultaneously once the interference field activated, each targeting a different objective within the 20-minute window. Nathan led the team assigned to the processing facility, considered the most critical and most dangerous target. Daniel accompanied him, along with 2 others from the shelter who had proven themselves capable during previous scavenging missions. Laura remained behind at the interference device, ready to make adjustments if needed, while Oliver coordinated communication between the 3 teams using short-range radios modified with technology derived from their study of alien communication systems. Once the field activates, you'll have 20 minutes, Laura reminded everyone gathered before they departed. After that, their systems will begin compensating, and everything becomes significantly more dangerous. Understood, Nathan said, checking his equipment one final time. Beside him, Daniel felt his heart pounding, a mixture of fear and determination that had become familiar over the past weeks but never entirely comfortable. At exactly 9 o'clock that evening, Laura activated the modified device. A faint pulse rippled outward, invisible to the naked eye but detectable through subtle shifts in the ambient hum that had become a constant, unnoticed background noise across the occupied city. Field is active, Oliver confirmed through the radio, his voice tight with tension. 20 minutes, starting now. The 3 teams moved simultaneously through the darkened streets, each racing against a clock that felt both impossibly short and unbearably long. Nathan's team approached the processing facility from the east, moving through the ruins of what had once been a residential neighborhood, now reduced to broken foundations and scattered debris. The facility itself was a strange, organic structure unlike anything built by human hands, its curved walls pulsing faintly with the same eerie light that characterized much of the Dominion's technology. Security around the perimeter appeared minimal, a fact that struck Nathan as either extremely fortunate or deeply concerning. "Something feels wrong," he muttered to Daniel as they approached. "Wrong how?" "Too easy," Nathan replied. "They wouldn't leave something this important, poorly guarded unless—" He didn't finish the thought, but Daniel understood the implication. Either the interference field was working exactly as intended, blinding the facility's security systems to their approach, or they were walking into something far more dangerous than anticipated. There was no time to reconsider. The team moved quickly toward the structure's base, where Oliver's intelligence suggested a critical support system could be found. Working fast, they placed explosive charges scavenged and modified from human military equipment recovered during earlier operations, positioning them at points Oliver had identified as structurally significant, based on his observations during captivity. Across the city, the other two teams executed their own objectives with similar urgency. At the relay station, a team led by Claire successfully disabled critical components, cutting off communication capability for the surrounding district. At the supply convoy's scheduled route, a third team intercepted and destroyed several transport vehicles, seizing valuable supplies before retreating into the shadows of the ruined city. Back at the processing facility, Nathan's team completed their preparations with just under 5 minutes remaining in their window. As they retreated to a safe distance, Nathan gave the signal, and the charges detonated in a coordinated sequence that sent a shockwave rippling through the structure's foundation. The facility didn't collapse immediately, but visible cracks spread rapidly across its curved surface, accompanied by flashes of light, and a sound unlike anything Daniel had heard before. A deep, resonant groan that seemed to come from the structure itself, rather than any conventional explosion. "Move!" Nathan shouted, and the team retreated quickly as alarms began sounding across the district, alien patrol crafts scrambling into action, as the interference field's effects began wearing off. The retreat back to the shelter was tense and dangerous, alien forces responding with an urgency that suggested genuine confusion and alarm, rather than the calm, methodical patrols that had characterized their presence throughout the occupation. Twice, the team narrowly avoided detection, pressing themselves into shadows and ruined doorways as patrol craft swept overhead with searchlights probing the darkness. They made it back to the shelter just before midnight, exhausted, adrenaline still coursing through their systems, but successful. Reports soon confirmed that all three operations had achieved their objectives, marking the first coordinated, multi-target resistance action since the invasion began. The following days brought both triumph and consequence. Alien patrol activity across London increased dramatically, security protocols tightening in response to the coordinated strikes. But alongside increased danger came something equally significant: confirmation that the Dominion could be hurt, that their technology and tactics, while still vastly superior to anything humanity possessed, were not invincible. News of the London operation spread quickly through resistance networks worldwide, carried by careful, coded communications that avoided detection through methods developed collectively across multiple cells. In Cairo, the successful power hub attack combined with London's example to inspire increased confidence among resistance leaders. In Tokyo, Kenji's network began planning their own coordinated action, drawing on lessons learned from London's success and mistakes. Back in Washington, General Marsh reviewed reports of the operation with something approaching genuine optimism for the first time since the invasion began. "This is exactly what we needed," he told the assembled team. "Proof that coordinated resistance can work and cause real damage." "There's something else," Grace Delaney added, pulling up additional data on the main display screen. "We've detected significant disruption in Dominion communication patterns following the London attacks. It's not just the immediate district that was affected. There's evidence of confusion rippling through their broader command structure." "Meaning?" Marsh asked. "Meaning their response protocols weren't designed to handle coordinated multi-target resistance," Grace explained. "They're having to reassess their entire operational approach in this region, which takes time and resources away from other priorities." Megan Voss, studying satellite imagery of shifting patrol patterns across multiple continents, nodded in agreement. "We're seeing similar disruption patterns beginning to emerge in other regions too. Even where resistance activity has been relatively minimal, it's like their confidence is cracking on a larger scale than we anticipated." This revelation carried significant strategic weight. The Dominion's rigid, centralized command structure, once considered a strength born from centuries of unchallenged conquest, was proving to be a genuine vulnerability when faced with unpredictable, adaptive resistance. Every successful action, no matter how small individually, contributed to a growing pattern of disruption that the Dominion's systems weren't designed to accommodate. In London, the shelter beneath the city had grown significantly since the invasion began, now housing nearly 80 survivors, including the 6 freed prisoners, and several others who had found their way to the group through word of successful resistance operations. Among the new arrivals was a young woman named Sophie Marlowe, a former journalist who had been documenting resistance activities across the city before being forced into hiding. People need to know what's happening, Sophie argued, during a meeting held to discuss the group's next steps. Not just here, but everywhere. If resistance movements around the world knew what London has accomplished, it could inspire similar action elsewhere. It's already spreading, Oliver pointed out, through the networks we've established. Not fast enough, Sophie insisted. And not to enough people. We need something more direct, more visible. Nathan considered her words carefully. The risk of increased visibility was significant, potentially drawing greater attention from Dominion forces already on high alert following the recent attacks. But the potential benefit, inspiring coordinated resistance on a scale beyond what isolated cells could achieve independently, felt equally significant. What did you have in mind? He asked. Sophie's plan, developed over subsequent days in careful consultation with Laura, Oliver, and the broader shelter community, involved using modified alien communication technology to broadcast a message across as wide an area as possible, documenting the successful resistance actions and calling for coordinated action among surviving human populations worldwide. It was an enormous risk. Broadcasting such a message would almost certainly draw significant attention from Dominion forces, potentially compromising the shelter's location and safety. But after extensive discussion, the group reached consensus that the potential benefit, inspiring widespread coordinated resistance, outweighed the risk. Laura worked tirelessly to modify their communication equipment, drawing on her growing understanding of Dominion technology to create a signal capable of reaching significant distances while remaining difficult to trace back to its exact origin point. Oliver contributed crucial technical knowledge from his time in captivity, while Sophie prepared the message itself, careful to convey both the reality of their struggle and the genuine hope born from recent successes. The broadcast, when it finally aired 3 days later, reached farther than anyone in the London shelter had anticipated. Resistance cells across Europe picked up fragments of the signal, relaying and amplifying the message through their own networks. Within days, reports began filtering back to London of similar broadcasts appearing in other regions, inspired by their example, each carrying news of successful resistance actions and calls for continued coordination. The Dominion's response was swift and severe. Patrol activity across London intensified dramatically, and for several tense days, the shelter's location remained at constant risk of discovery. But the broadcast had already achieved its purpose, spreading word of humanity's growing resistance, far beyond what any single group could have managed alone. In Washington, General Marsh received reports of the broadcast with a complex mixture of concern and cautious approval. "It's reckless," he admitted, during a briefing with his senior staff. "But it's also exactly the kind of bold action we need if we're going to build something larger than isolated pockets of resistance." Grace Delaney agreed, though she too recognized the significant risk involved. The Dominion built their empire on the assumption that conquered populations would remain fragmented and disorganized. Every message like this that spreads, every coordinated action that succeeds, chips away at that assumption. As weeks passed following the broadcast, resistance movements around the world began showing increasing signs of coordination, drawing inspiration and practical lessons from London's example, while adapting strategies to their own unique circumstances. In Cairo, engineers successfully replicated Laura's interference technology, enabling their own coordinated strikes against Dominion infrastructure. In Sao Paulo, Isabella's network expanded significantly, incorporating lessons learned from London's broadcast to improve their own communication and coordination capabilities. Back in London, the shelter faced increasing pressure as Dominion forces intensified their search for the source of the broadcast and the resistance cells responsible for recent attacks. Nathan and the broader leadership group made the difficult decision to relocate, moving their operation to a new, more secure location beneath the city, while maintaining the networks and relationships they had built over the preceding weeks. "This isn't the end," Nathan told the assembled group during their final night in the original shelter, as preparations for relocation continued around them. "This is just the beginning. What we started here, it's spreading, it's growing, and there's no putting that back in the box now." Daniel, standing beside Laura as she carefully packed the modified equipment that had become central to their resistance efforts, felt a profound shift in his understanding of their situation. Weeks earlier, he had been a frightened civilian, hiding in an underground parking garage with strangers, uncertain if humanity had any hope of survival, let alone genuine resistance. Now, he stood among people who had proven, through hard-won experience and careful innovation, that the Dominion's overwhelming power was not without vulnerability. "Do you think we can actually win this?" he asked Laura quietly, as the group prepared to move to their new location under cover of darkness. Laura considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know we've already accomplished more than anyone thought possible 3 weeks ago. And if we keep learning, keep adapting, keep proving that we won't simply give up, I think we have a real chance." As the group moved through the darkened streets toward their new shelter, carrying with them the accumulated knowledge, technology, and hard-won experience of the past weeks, the broader picture of humanity's resistance was beginning to take clearer shape. What had started as scattered, desperate survival was evolving into something more organized, more strategic, and increasingly, more dangerous to the Dominion's continued control. Above the city, alien patrol crafts continued their search, more urgent now, more focused, as the Dominion began to grapple with a reality they had never encountered before, across all their years of galactic conquest. The population they had expected to break within days had instead grown stronger, more coordinated, and more determined with each passing week. The turning point had arrived, quietly but unmistakably, in a broken city beneath a sky once dominated entirely by an enemy that had never expected to be challenged. And as word of humanity's resistance continued spreading across the globe and, unknowingly, beyond it, the Vareth Dominion was about to discover just how significant that turning point would become. 6 weeks after the invasion began, something unprecedented started happening, far beyond the reach of any human resistance cell. Deep within the Vareth Dominion's territory, on worlds that had been conquered decades or even centuries earlier, quiet murmurs of unrest began spreading among populations that had long since given up any hope of resistance. The source of these murmurs traced back, though few realized it at the time, to fragments of the London broadcast that had been intercepted and passed along through channels the Dominion never anticipated. Alien traders operating on the fringes of Dominion territory, smugglers moving between conquered worlds, and even some sympathetic elements within the Dominion's own ranks had begun quietly sharing news of a small, primitive planet that refused to submit. On a world called Thren, located several systems away from Earth, an alien resistance leader named Vesik Kal received fragments of translated human broadcasts through an underground network of dissidents who had been planning quiet resistance for years without ever finding the courage or opportunity to act. The idea that a species with technology far inferior to the Dominion's could not only survive initial conquest but actively strike back ignited something long dormant among Thren's oppressed population. "They call themselves humans," Vesik explained to a gathering of fellow resistance members, hidden deep within tunnels that ran beneath Thren's primary settlement. "Primitive, by every measure the Dominion uses to judge conquered species. And yet, they fight, they adapt, they refuse to accept defeat." The information was incomplete, fragmented, and filtered through multiple translations that likely distorted much of the original message. But the core truth remained clear enough. Humanity's resistance had proven that the Dominion's seemingly absolute power could be challenged, and that challenge was beginning to inspire similar movements across the galaxy. Back on Earth, the London Resistance Cell, now operating from their new underground location, continued refining their strategies and expanding their network. Nathan Pierce had taken on an increasingly central leadership role, coordinating not just local operations but also communication with resistance cells across Europe, and, through increasingly sophisticated relay systems developed by Laura and Oliver, connections with resistance movements on other continents. We've established regular contact with cells in Cairo, Tokyo, and Sao Paulo, Oliver reported during a strategy meeting held in their new shelter, a converted underground rail maintenance facility that offered significantly more space and security than their previous location. Each has developed their own strategies based on local conditions, but there's clear value in sharing intelligence and coordinating larger operations. What kind of larger operations? Asked Claire, who had continued growing into her role as one of the shelter's key coordinators. Laura pulled up a series of diagrams she had been developing over the preceding weeks, mapping out potential coordinated strikes across multiple continents simultaneously. If we can time attacks against critical Dominion infrastructure across several regions at once, it could create disruption significant enough to force a genuine strategic response from their command structure, rather than the localized adjustments we've seen so far. The plan represented a significant escalation from previous operations, requiring unprecedented coordination between resistance cells that had, until recently, operated largely independently. But the growing evidence of Dominion vulnerability, combined with increasing confidence born from repeated successful operations, made the ambitious plan feel increasingly achievable, rather than reckless. Meanwhile, in Washington, General Marsh's team had begun receiving increasingly detailed intelligence, suggesting that humanity's resistance was having effects reaching far beyond Earth itself. Grace Delaney, analyzing patterns in Dominion communication and ship movement data gathered through various resistance networks, noticed troubling and promising signs simultaneously. There's increased ship traffic between Earth and what appears to be a central command location, she reported during a briefing. Based on communication patterns, I believe the Dominion's leadership is becoming increasingly concerned about the broader implications of our resistance. Broader implications how? Marsh asked. Grace hesitated, still working through incomplete data. I think, she said carefully, our resistance might be inspiring similar movements among other species under Dominion control. If that's true, it would explain the shift in their operational focus we've been observing. The implications, if accurate, were staggering. Humanity's resistance, born from desperate survival instinct in the face of overwhelming invasion, might be contributing to instability across the Dominion's entire empire, an outcome nobody involved in those early, desperate days of resistance could have anticipated or intended. Back on Thren, Vesic Call's resistance movement began taking concrete action, drawing inspiration from what limited information they had received about human resistance tactics. Using methods adapted from their fragmented understanding of Earth's guerrilla operations, Thren's resistance successfully disrupted several Dominion supply convoys, marking the first significant resistance action on that world in over a decade. News of Thren's success, filtered back through the same underground networks that had originally carried word of humanity's resistance, began reaching other conquered worlds across Dominion territory. On a distant world called Kasari, populated by an aquatic species that had submitted to Dominion control generations earlier, resistance leaders began cautiously exploring similar strategies. On the industrial world of Ordath, workers who had long endured oppressive labor conditions under Dominion oversight began organizing quiet acts of sabotage, inspired by whispered stories of a primitive species that refused to break. None of this was coordinated in any centralized sense. Communication across such vast distances remained slow, fragmented, and dangerous. But a pattern was emerging nonetheless, a galaxy-wide ripple effect born from humanity's stubborn refusal to accept defeat, spreading through channels the Dominion had never anticipated needing to monitor or control. Within the Dominion's central command structure, this growing pattern of unrest began causing significant internal tension. A high-ranking commander named Threxus Vol, who had originally overseen the invasion of Earth, found himself facing increasing criticism from fellow commanders and political leaders who blamed his underestimation of human resistance for the broader instability now spreading across Dominion territory. "You assured us Earth would fall within days," a senior political leader named Orlath Ven stated during a tense meeting aboard the Dominion's Central Command vessel. "Instead, we find ourselves dealing with unrest on multiple worlds, unrest directly inspired by your failure to properly subdue this primitive species. Threxus, though outwardly composed, felt the weight of genuine concern beneath his measured response. Every previous conquest followed established patterns. Humanity's resistance represents a statistical anomaly, nothing more. An anomaly that is now inspiring rebellion across multiple systems, Orlath countered sharply. This is no longer a minor operational concern, Commander. This is becoming a crisis that threatens the stability of our entire empire. The tension within Dominion leadership reflected a broader truth, that humanity's resistance leaders, still fighting desperately for survival on Earth, remained largely unaware of. Their struggle, born from immediate necessity rather than any grand strategic vision, was contributing to consequences reaching far beyond what any of them could have imagined when they first began organizing resistance in basements, parking garages, and hidden shelters across a broken world. Back in London, preparations for the coordinated multi-continent strike continued, drawing together resistance cells across Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America in an unprecedented collaborative effort. Laura and Oliver worked tirelessly to refine their interference technology, developing versions that could be replicated more easily by resistance cells with limited technical resources. If this works, Oliver told the assembled leadership group during final preparations, it will be the largest coordinated resistance action since the invasion began. Simultaneous strikes across multiple continents, targeting critical infrastructure and communication systems. And if it doesn't work? Sophie Marlowe asked, her journalist instincts pushing her to consider every possible outcome. Nathan answered before Oliver could respond. Then we learn from it, and we try again. That's what we've been doing since this all started. That's what's gotten us this far. The operation, scheduled to take place under cover of darkness across multiple time zones simultaneously, represented months of accumulated knowledge, hard-won experience, and careful coordination between resistance networks that had grown from isolated, desperate survival groups into something approaching genuine organized resistance movements. As the appointed hour approached, tension gripped resistance cells across the globe, each team preparing for their specific objective while remaining acutely aware of the broader significance of their coordinated action. In London, Nathan's team prepared to target a major Dominion communication hub that had been established following the earlier successful strikes against smaller relay stations. In Cairo, engineers prepared to disable a critical power distribution network. In Tokyo, Kenji's network prepared coordinated strikes against multiple patrol routes simultaneously. In Sao Paulo, Isabella's expanded network prepared to disrupt Dominion supply lines across the broader region. The operation began precisely on schedule, interference fields activating across multiple locations within minutes of each other, creating temporary blind spots that resistance teams exploited with increasing confidence and precision, born from weeks of accumulated experience. Reports of successful strikes began filtering back to coordination centers within hours, each success building momentum and confirming the viability of large-scale coordinated resistance. In Washington, General Marsh and his team monitored the operation's progress with tense anticipation, watching satellite feeds and intercepted communication patterns for any indication of the Dominion's response. As reports of successful strikes accumulated, Grace Delaney noted significant disruption spreading through Dominion communication networks, far beyond the immediate areas targeted by the coordinated operation. Their command structure is struggling to process simultaneous incidents across multiple continents, she reported, studying the shifting patterns with growing excitement. This is exactly the kind of coordinated pressure that could force genuine strategic reconsideration on their part. The operation's success, while not without cost, marked a significant turning point in humanity's resistance efforts. Several resistance cells suffered losses during the coordinated strikes, brave individuals who gave everything to ensure the operation's success, their sacrifices adding weight and meaning to the broader struggle against Dominion occupation. Back in London, as the team regrouped following their successful strike against the communication hub, Nathan addressed the assembled resistance members with a mixture of pride and solemn recognition of the cost involved. What we accomplished tonight, across multiple continents, represents something the Dominion never anticipated when they first arrived. We've proven that humanity's resistance isn't just isolated pockets of desperate survival. We've become something organized, something coordinated, something they now have to take seriously. Sophie, documenting the operation's aftermath for future broadcast, felt the weight of the moment deeply. This changes everything, doesn't it? It's a start, Nathan replied carefully, mindful of the losses the operation had cost. But we've still got a long way to go. Within Dominion command structure, the coordinated strike triggered exactly the kind of crisis Orlath Ven had warned about weeks earlier. Threxus Vol found himself facing formal review of his handling of Earth's occupation, while broader unrest continued spreading across multiple conquered worlds, each inspired in some fashion by news of humanity's growing, coordinated resistance. This cannot continue, Orlath declared during an emergency session of Dominion leadership. Earth's resistance has become a symbol, threatening the stability of our entire empire. We need a decisive response, immediate and overwhelming, to crush this rebellion before it spreads further. Threxus, recognizing the precarious position he now occupied, proposed exactly such a response. Send reinforcements, overwhelming force, sufficient to crush their resistance permanently, and send an unmistakable message to any other worlds considering similar action. The proposal received support from Dominion leadership, desperate to contain the growing crisis, setting in motion preparations for a significant escalation in the conflict, one that would bring the full weight of Dominion military might to bear against Earth's resistance movement in a final, decisive confrontation. Back on Earth, resistance networks continued expanding and strengthening in the aftermath of their successful coordinated strike, unaware of the storm gathering in response to their growing defiance. Laura and Oliver continued refining their technology, sharing improvements across the broader resistance network. Nathan and other leadership figures across multiple continents began discussing increasingly ambitious plans for continued resistance, building on the momentum and confidence born from recent successes. In Washington, intelligence gathered through various resistance networks began suggesting the Dominion was preparing something significant, though the exact nature and scale of their planned response remained unclear. They're moving additional forces toward Earth, Grace Delaney reported during a tense briefing session. Based on the patterns we're seeing, this could represent a significant escalation. General Marsh studied the incoming data with grim determination. Then we need to be ready for whatever comes next. Across the globe, resistance leaders received similar warnings through their expanding communication networks, understanding that their recent successes, while significant, had also drawn increased attention and potential retaliation from an enemy determined to reassert absolute control. The galaxy-wide ripples caused by humanity's stubborn resistance had achieved something remarkable, inspiring similar movements across Dominion territory and forcing genuine strategic reconsideration within their command structure. But that same success now placed Earth's resistance movement directly in the path of whatever overwhelming response the Dominion was preparing to unleash, setting the stage for a confrontation that would determine not just humanity's fate, but potentially the broader stability of the Vareth Dominion's entire galactic empire. As preparations continued on both sides, the quiet, desperate resistance that had begun in basements and parking garages weeks earlier had grown into something with implications reaching far beyond what anyone involved could have initially imagined, setting the stage for a final, decisive chapter in humanity's fight for survival and freedom. The warning came 3 days before the reinforcements arrived, carried through a fractured signal intercepted by Grace Delaney's team in Washington, and confirmed by similar reports filtering in from resistance networks across the globe. A massive Dominion fleet, far larger than the forces that had originally conquered Earth, was moving toward the planet with a single, unmistakable purpose: to crush humanity's resistance once and for all. This isn't a patrol reinforcement, Grace explained during an emergency meeting that connected leadership from resistance networks across multiple continents through their improved communication systems. Based on ship count and formation patterns, this represents a full-scale military response, potentially several times larger than the original invasion force. In London, Nathan Pierce listened to Grace's assessment through a modified radio relay, surrounded by the leadership of what had become one of the most significant resistance networks in Europe. Beside him, Laura Whitfield and Oliver Bramwell exchanged a worried glance, both understanding the technical implications of facing a force of that magnitude. "How long until they arrive?" Nathan asked. 3 days, maybe less," came Marsh's voice through the relay. "We need every resistance network coordinated and ready before then." The following 72 hours became a blur of frantic preparation across the globe. Resistance cells that had spent weeks developing independent strategies now worked to coordinate a unified defense, sharing technology, tactics, and hard-won knowledge through networks that had grown increasingly sophisticated since the early days of scattered, desperate survival. In London, Laura worked around the clock alongside Oliver and a growing team of engineers and scientists who had joined the resistance movement, refining their interference technology and developing new countermeasures based on everything they had learned about Dominion systems over the preceding weeks. Sleep became a luxury nobody could afford, replaced by an urgent, focused determination to prepare for whatever the coming confrontation would demand. "We can't match their firepower directly," Oliver acknowledged during one of countless strategy sessions held in the converted underground facility that served as London's resistance headquarters. "But we understand their systems now, their communication patterns, their tactical rigidity. If we can exploit those weaknesses at scale, we might be able to offset their numerical and technological advantage." Nathan nodded, studying maps and diagrams spread across the makeshift command center. "What do you need?" "Time," Laura said simply, "and coordination across every resistance network we've established contact with." Across the globe, similar preparations unfolded with remarkable urgency and determination. In Cairo, engineers worked to scale up their power disruption technology, preparing to target critical Dominion infrastructure across a much wider area than any previous operation. In Tokyo, Kenji Sato coordinated with resistance leaders across Asia, establishing a network of early warning systems designed to track the approaching fleet's movements and provide crucial intelligence to defensive operations worldwide. In Sao Paulo, Isabella's network expanded rapidly, incorporating volunteers and resources from across South America in preparation for what everyone understood would be humanity's most significant confrontation yet. In Washington, General Marsh worked closely with what remained of formal military structures, coordinating with resistance leadership to develop a comprehensive defensive strategy that combined conventional military knowledge with the hard-won tactical innovations developed by resistance networks over the preceding weeks. "We're not going to win this through direct confrontation," Marsh acknowledged during a final strategy session held just hours before the Dominion fleet's projected arrival. "Our only chance is to make their overwhelming force ineffective through coordinated disruption, forcing them into situations where their technological advantage matters less." Grace Delaney, working alongside Marsh, had developed a comprehensive strategy based on everything resistance networks had learned about Dominion vulnerabilities over the preceding weeks. Their command structure struggles with simultaneous, unpredictable challenges across multiple fronts. If we can create that exact scenario at a scale matching their reinforcement fleet, we have a genuine chance of disrupting their operations significantly. The plan that emerged from these final preparations represented the culmination of everything humanity's resistance had learned since the invasion began. Rather than attempting to match the Dominion's overwhelming firepower directly, resistance networks across the globe would work to create widespread simultaneous disruption targeting communication systems, power infrastructure, and coordination capabilities, exploiting the same rigid command structure that had proven vulnerable in previous, smaller-scale operations. As the Dominion fleet entered Earth's atmosphere, resistance networks across the globe activated their coordinated defense simultaneously. Massive ships, far larger and more numerous than those that had originally conquered the planet, began deploying toward major population centers and known resistance strongholds, moving with the confident precision of a force expecting swift, decisive victory. In London, as alien ships began appearing overhead, in numbers that dwarfed the original invasion force, Laura activated the largest interference field her team had ever attempted, drawing on technology and power sources gathered from resistance networks across Europe. The field rippled outward, creating disruption across a significantly larger area than any previous operation. "Field active," she reported, her voice tight with tension, as she monitored readings that suggested the massive scale of their effort was pushing their technology to its absolute limits. "I don't know how long we can sustain this." Across the city, resistance teams moved quickly to exploit the disruption, targeting critical infrastructure and communication systems with precision. born from weeks of accumulated experience. Nathan led a team toward a newly established Dominion command post, working alongside Daniel and several others who had grown from frightened survivors into capable, determined resistance fighters over the preceding weeks. "They're not responding the way they did before," Daniel observed as they moved through the chaos, noting the confused, scattered patterns in Dominion troop movements around them. "Something's different." "The scale," Nathan replied, understanding immediately. "They've never faced disruption at this magnitude before. Their command structure is struggling to process it." Similar scenes unfolded across the globe, as resistance networks executed their coordinated defense with increasing confidence. In Cairo, engineers successfully disabled power infrastructure across a wide area, creating cascading failures that disrupted Dominion operations far beyond their immediate targets. In Tokyo, Kenji's early warning network provided crucial intelligence that allowed resistance forces to avoid direct confrontation while striking at vulnerable support systems. In Sao Paulo, Isabella's expanded network executed coordinated strikes that significantly hampered Dominion's supply and communication capabilities across the region. Aboard the Dominion's command vessel, Threxus Vol watched with growing alarm as reports of widespread disruption flooded in from across the planet's surface. What should have been a swift, overwhelming demonstration of force was instead becoming a chaotic, unpredictable confrontation, unlike anything he had experienced across his long career of galactic conquest. "Status report," he demanded, studying tactical displays showing confused, scattered patterns across multiple continents simultaneously. "Communication systems are experiencing significant disruption across nearly every major operational zone," a subordinate officer reported, tension evident in his voice. "Coordination between ground forces and command is becoming increasingly difficult." Threxus felt the weight of the situation settling heavily upon him. Everything about this campaign had defied the established patterns that had guided Dominion conquest for centuries. A primitive species, vastly inferior in every measurable technological capacity, was somehow managing to create chaos and disruption on a scale that threatened the entire operation's success. "Deploy additional forces to restore order," he commanded, though even as he gave the order, uncertainty crept into his usually confident demeanor. "We cannot allow this resistance to continue disrupting our operations." But as additional forces deployed across the planet's surface, resistance networks continued adapting and responding, with a flexibility that Dominion forces, trained for centuries in rigid hierarchical tactics, struggled to match. Every attempt to restore order created new opportunities for resistance networks to exploit, their intimate knowledge of Earth's terrain and infrastructure providing crucial advantages that offset the Dominion's overwhelming technological superiority. In London, as the confrontation stretched into its second hour, Laura's interference field began showing signs of strain, power reserves depleting faster than anticipated under the massive scale of their sustained effort.
"We're losing coverage," she reported urgently to Nathan and the broader coordination team.
"Maybe 30 more minutes before the field collapses entirely." Nathan understood immediately what this meant. Their window for decisive action was closing rapidly, and whatever they hoped to accomplish needed to happen before Dominion forces regained full operational capability. "Oliver," he said, turning to the scientist who had contributed so much crucial intelligence throughout their resistance campaign, "what's our best option for maximum impact before the field collapses?" Oliver considered the question carefully, drawing on everything he had learned during his captivity and subsequent work with the resistance. "Their command vessel. If we can disrupt its systems directly, even temporarily, it could create confusion significant enough to affect their entire operational capacity across the region." It was an enormously risky proposal, requiring resistance forces to directly target the massive command ship hovering above London, protected by defenses far more sophisticated than anything they had previously attempted to breach. But with their interference fields remaining time-limited, and the confrontation's outcome still genuinely uncertain, the potential reward seemed to justify the significant risk involved. "We need everyone we can gather," Nathan said, already formulating a plan. "Every resistance fighter available, every piece of technology we've developed. This is it." Word spread quickly through London's resistance network, drawing together fighters from across the city for what would become the campaign's most decisive confrontation. Daniel found himself standing alongside dozens of others he had come to know over the preceding weeks, people who had transformed from frightened survivors into capable, determined resistance fighters through shared struggle and hard-won experience. "Are you ready for this?" Claire asked him quietly as they prepared to move toward their objective. Daniel considered the question honestly. Fear remained a constant companion, as it had been since that first terrifying day when alien ships appeared over London's skyline. But alongside that fear, now existed something equally powerful. Determination born from weeks of proving, again and again, that humanity's resistance could not simply be crushed through overwhelming force alone. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied. The assault on the Dominion command vessel began as Laura's interference field entered its final minutes of operation, resistance fighters moving with coordinated precision toward the massive ship's most vulnerable points, identified through careful analysis of everything they had learned about Dominion technology over the preceding weeks. The confrontation that followed was intense and costly, resistance fighters facing significant Dominion defenses, even with the temporary advantage provided by widespread communication disruption. Nathan led the primary assault team, working alongside Daniel and several others toward a section of the command vessel's hull that Oliver had identified as containing critical systems based on fragments of knowledge gathered during his earlier captivity. The fighting was fierce, resistance forces relying on improvised weapons and tactical creativity to overcome defenses far more sophisticated than anything they had previously encountered. As Laura's interference field finally collapsed, plunging the confrontation into a new, more dangerous phase where Dominion systems began rapidly restoring full operational capability, Nathan's team reached their objective, planting modified explosive charges at points identified as critical to the command vessel's operational systems. "Fall back!" Nathan shouted as the charges were set, the team retreating as quickly as possible, while Dominion defenses began responding with renewed effectiveness now that the interference field no longer masked their approach. The explosion that followed sent shockwaves through the massive vessel, disabling critical systems and creating chaos throughout its command structure. Aboard the ship, Threxus Vol felt the impact directly, alarms blaring as damage reports flooded in from multiple sections simultaneously. "Command systems are failing," an officer reported urgently. "We're losing coordination capability across the entire fleet." The disruption, though temporary, proved decisive in the broader confrontation. Without centralized command coordination, Dominion forces across the globe found themselves increasingly unable to respond effectively to the continued resistance actions unfolding simultaneously across multiple continents. What had begun as an overwhelming demonstration of force was rapidly devolving into confused, scattered engagements that increasingly favored resistance networks, superior local knowledge, and tactical flexibility. In Washington, General Marsh and his team watched the unfolding chaos with cautious, growing optimism. "Their coordination is completely breaking down," Grace Delaney reported, studying data streams showing dramatic shifts in Dominion operational patterns across the globe. "This is exactly the kind of disruption we hope to achieve." As the confrontation continued through the following hours, resistance networks across the globe capitalized on the Dominion's disrupted command structure, executing coordinated strikes that significantly degraded their operational capability across multiple regions. The overwhelming reinforcement fleet that had arrived with such confident expectation of swift, decisive victory instead found itself facing a resistance movement that had grown far more capable and coordinated than anyone within Dominion Command had anticipated. By the following morning, as exhausted resistance fighters across the globe began assessing the confrontation's outcome, reports confirmed a significant, if costly, victory. The Dominion's reinforcement fleet, having suffered substantial disruption to its command and coordination capabilities, began a gradual, unmistakable withdrawal from the most heavily contested regions, unable to sustain their intended overwhelming demonstration of force against a resistance movement that had proven far more resilient and capable than any previous conquest in Dominion history. In London, as Nathan, Daniel, Laura, Oliver, and the broader resistance community gathered to assess the confrontation's aftermath, the cost of their victory became clear. Several members of their community had given their lives during the intense fighting, their sacrifices woven permanently into the story of humanity's resistance against overwhelming odds. "We did it," Claire said quietly, though her voice carried the weight of losses that tempered any purely celebratory feeling. "We actually did it." Nathan nodded, understanding both the significance of their achievement and the genuine cost involved. "We're not finished," he said carefully, "but we've proven something today that changes everything going forward." Aboard the retreating Dominion fleet, Threxus Vol faced the difficult reality of reporting this unprecedented setback to Dominion leadership, understanding that humanity's resistance had achieved something no other conquered species had managed in centuries of galactic expansion, forcing a strategic retreat through coordinated, adaptive resistance rather than simple, easily crushed rebellion. The news of Earth's successful resistance against the reinforcement fleet spread rapidly through the same underground networks that had originally carried word of humanity's initial defiance, reaching worlds across Dominion territory and significantly accelerating the unrest already spreading among conquered populations, inspired by humanity's example. On Thren, Vesic Kal's resistance movement, emboldened by news of Earth's decisive victory, escalated their own operations significantly. On Kasari and Ordath, similar movements gained momentum, drawing direct inspiration from humanity's proven ability to resist and ultimately overcome seemingly overwhelming Dominion force. Within Dominion leadership, the setback at Earth triggered significant political upheaval. Orlath Ven and other leaders who had pushed for the overwhelming reinforcement response found themselves facing difficult questions about the broader stability of an empire, increasingly challenged by inspired resistance movements across multiple worlds. Threxus Vol, having overseen both the initial invasion and the failed reinforcement campaign, faced formal consequences for his role in what Dominion leadership now recognized as a significant strategic failure. Weeks following the decisive confrontation, as resistance networks across Earth worked to consolidate their gains and continue building toward genuine, lasting freedom from Dominion control, communication finally arrived through channels established by sympathetic elements within the broader galactic community. The Dominion, facing mounting instability across their empire and unable to sustain the resources required for continued overwhelming force against Earth's proven resilient resistance, had begun exploring alternative approaches to their relationship with the planet they had once expected to conquer easily. In Washington, General Marsh, Grace Delaney, and the broader coalition of resistance leadership from around the globe gathered to discuss this unprecedented development. "They're not simply retreating," Grace explained, studying the intercepted communications carefully. "They're proposing negotiation, some kind of formal acknowledgement of Earth's sovereignty in exchange for ending hostilities." The proposal, when finally confirmed and shared with resistance leadership across the globe, represented something nobody had dared hope for during those first, desperate days of the invasion. Genuine recognition that humanity's resistance had achieved what no other species in Dominion history had managed, forcing a galactic empire to reconsider its approach to conquest entirely. In London, as news of the potential negotiation spread through the resistance community, Nathan gathered with Laura, Oliver, Daniel, Claire, Sophie, and the many others who had transformed from frightened survivors into a capable, coordinated resistance movement over the preceding months. The underground facility that had served as their headquarters through the campaign's most intense periods now buzzed with a mixture of cautious hope and hard-earned pride. "We're not just surviving anymore," Sophie observed, preparing what would become a historic broadcast documenting humanity's remarkable achievement. "We forced them to see us as something worth negotiating with." Nathan looked around at the faces surrounding him, each marked by the shared struggle and sacrifice of the preceding months, yet also carrying something new, genuine hope for a future that had seemed impossible when alien ships first darkened London's sky. "They came here expecting an easy conquest," he said, addressing the assembled community that had grown from a handful of frightened strangers into something far more significant. "They learned, the hard way, that humanity doesn't break that easily." As formal negotiations began between human representatives and Dominion officials in the weeks that followed, humanity's resistance movement continued strengthening its position, ensuring that whatever agreement emerged would genuinely respect Earth's sovereignty and independence, rather than simply representing a temporary pause in hostilities. The scars of the invasion remained deep and permanent. Cities forever changed, lives forever altered, by the trauma of those desperate early days. But amid that lasting scar, something remarkable had also taken root, proof that even facing overwhelming odds, even confronting a seemingly unstoppable galactic power, human resilience, ingenuity, and unwavering determination could accomplish what logic alone suggested was impossible. Earth emerged from the confrontation forever changed, no longer viewed across the galaxy as an easy, primitive target for conquest, but as a planet that had proven, through hard-won sacrifice and remarkable determination, that it would never simply accept defeat. And as word of humanity's achievement continued spreading across Dominion territory, inspiring similar movements among other conquered worlds, the galaxy itself began slowly transforming, forever marked by the moment a small, primitive planet refused to break under the weight of an empire that had never before encountered resistance it couldn't simply crush. The Varith Dominion had arrived at Earth expecting an easy, inevitable conquest. Instead, they had discovered something they would never forget, and something the rest of the galaxy would remember for generations to come: humanity's unbreakable will to survive, adapt, and ultimately, strike back.